The stakes for Avatar's CGI were so ridiculously high that director James Cameron was actually quoted saying that he wanted to kill himself when their initial attempts at this CGI looked bad. And this is because, let's be honest, none of us were really watching this for its story, and in fact, the real star of the show was of course its fantastic 3D effects and CGI achievements. However, when the star of the show is the CGI, and therefore the film's narrative largely came second to that, does this mean that Avatar was basically just this soulless tech demo, and as such, that's why a lot of audiences disconnected from it? Or was this film, with all of its ridiculous technical breakthroughs, actually reaching for something truly novel that we all kind of failed to appreciate, and that now might be something that we'll never see again? Because basically every single element of Avatar's production, from the way they acted it, to the way they filmed it, to even the way it was edited, was all done in this incredibly unique way that basically no other films outside of this franchise have even been able to replicate. And so that's why we're going to break down this film's very special achievements to explore why this is a literal once-in-a-lifetime production that basically had to reinvent CGI from the ground up in order to get any of this to work, how they made an entirely CGI planet with its own fully functioning ecosystem and everything, and finally why this unique editing method that we just mentioned is probably also the main cause as to why this film has this somewhat synthetic feeling to it that probably caused people to disconnect with it in the first place. So, to understand how this one movie genuinely revolutionized both visual effects and filmmaking forever, grab yourself by your unobtainium as we dive into the blue, foresty world of Avatar. So, why did they decide to make a film that was basically just wall-to-wall CGI? And was this just a tech demo, or was there something more to this? Well, despite eventually coming out in 2009, the story of Avatar kind of actually begins all the way back in 1993. Because at this time, Avatar's director, James Cameron, and a few other people decided to set up their own visual effects company called Digital Domain, as they observed that Hollywood was slowly moving in this more CGI heavy direction, and therefore wanted to be ahead of the curve by making Digital Domain into the best and most cutting edge visual effects company in the world. However, whilst this was a good idea, and they were right that Hollywood was going to get more CGI heavy, due to the types of films that were coming out around the time that Digital Domain was founded, the only visual effects contracts that they were actually winning were for the more simplistic films that only required things like basic cleanup work, and so weren't at all the sort of cutting edge stuff you saw in films like Terminator 2 or Jurassic Park that was presumably what inspired them to start Digital Domain in the first place. And so in response to this limitation of just getting basic work, James Cameron deliberately began to think of a film that could push the boundaries of visual effects further than any other film in history. And that film was, of course, Avatar. However, in retrospect, these massive pushed boundaries that James Cameron had in his head back in the day weren't actually being pushed that far at all. Because yeah, in 1995, Cameron quickly wrote up a treatment for Avatar before then having to run off and start preparation on Titanic. And in this treatment, the pushed boundaries for the visual effects were only actually going to be just a few steps beyond what Jurassic Park had already achieved, where rather than having a fully digital rainforest like they did in the final movie, the idea was instead very similar to Jurassic Park, that they'd film in a real-world environment, then just add their digital characters over that footage. But the one big evolution, and therefore the one big problem, was that, unlike the CGI dinosaurs who kind of just had these blank expressionless faces and only actually a limited bit of screen time, the original Avatar CGI characters were going to have to be both fully emotive and in the movie for a significant amount of time. And so to do this, it meant that not only would they have to be able to capture the movement of the actor's body on the computer so that they could therefore drive the digital character's physical performance like we so often see these days, but much more importantly, they were also going to have to be able to capture the actor's face on the computer as well, so that they could also drive the character's emotional performance. And at the end of the day, it was actually because of the difficulty of this facial capture process that this original Avatar project sadly had to be shelved. And you know what else is an idea that we should just throw away? The fact that we let our personal data float around the internet for years just waiting for some scammer or some weirdo to find it. As in the past, I genuinely didn't really worry about this. But with modern AI being able to mimic my voice or even my face and then having access to my private information like my phone number, my name, or even my home address, then this suddenly presents a genuine level of danger. And so this is where today's sponsor, Incogni, can lend a hand. Because basically, Incogni uses a process that's been independently verified by Deloitte to go through these places that have your data and ensure that your data is absolutely purged from their systems and is therefore completely out of the hands of whichever bad actor wants to use it. And so after going through their incredibly simple setup of just a few clicks a couple of weeks ago, I've noticed that I literally haven't had a single spam call since. And so it's given me so much peace of mind knowing how much more difficult it is for scammers to do anything to you if they can't find you in the first place. And what's even better than this is, with Incogni's new custom removals feature, you can even just send them specific links to locations where your data shows up, and Incogni will just deal with it for you, no questions asked. So use my link below or go to incogni.com/CGY to get 60% off and to make your personal data unobtainable. And with that, now back to the video and back to why the difficulties of this facial capture process meant that the original Avatar project had to be scrapped. Because even though at the time it was possible to do performance capture for a character's body, for example, lots of the extras in Cameron's Titanic were motion captured, doing the performance capture for an actor's face was still years away. And so sadly, the blue people were going to have to wait until the day that this facial capture process was finally possible to make their debut on the big screen. Which, to James Cameron, wasn't actually the end of the world, as he believed that Avatar was this timeless story, meaning that he could delay making this for 2 years or 20 years and the story would still work. And so he went off and made Titanic and a bunch of other films, leaving his original concept for Avatar to just gather dust somewhere until finally, in 2005, when he felt the time and the technology was finally right to begin pursuing this groundbreaking project. And so this meant that he was going to need a lot of money. Because despite 2005 CGI getting pretty outstanding at this point, none of it was comparable to the demands of what we saw in the final version of Avatar in 2009. And so this meant that a significant degree of research and development was going to be needed to get to the point where they were actually ready to meet those demands. And it's actually at this research and development stage where, to me, the first sign that Avatar was going to be something truly special really begins to kick in. Because typically in visual effects, you can basically only work with the technology that was used in the films directly before yours, and then just ever so slightly evolve that in your film. And so that's why you can see that slow creep of improvement for characters like Jar Jar Binks, to Gollum, to Davy Jones, because when you're limited to the tools that the film just before you used, it really means that you can only make small, tiny individual steps, taking you years to get anywhere. But when you're trying to make the most groundbreaking film ever, of course, a slight improvement over the last film was not what James Cameron was looking for. And so, because of this, he went and pitched the whole concept of Avatar to the film studio, Fox, and asked them to finance him for an entire year so that he could generate a proof of concept for this film, which would not only cover the development of everything we've discussed so far, like the emotive facial capture system, but also to concept all of the digital animals, tech, characters, machinery, weapons, and most importantly, to make his new idea of having a fully digital rainforest work as well. And to this kind of outlandish request, Fox actually said yes. And to me, that is one of the biggest reasons as to why this film is so special. Because I feel as if anyone but James Cameron walked into your office and asked for a year's worth of money just to make a proof of concept with no promise of either a final film or profit, they'd just get laughed right out of the building. But because Cameron had built up such a fantastic professional reputation via films like Terminator or Titanic, it meant that he was one of the few few people in the world who a movie studio could reasonably take such a gamble on. And so, with the money in the bank and a year on the clock, this is when what the film's virtual production supervisor, Glenn Derry, described as a once-in-a-lifetime experience in Hollywood finally kicked off. Where, like we said, rather than being limited to the technology that the film before you had just used, now they had an entire year to get everything exactly right with absolutely no limits and nobody telling them they couldn't do it. And so, with this research and development, they primarily needed to nail down two things. Firstly, they would need to master their facial capture process and get it to work so seamlessly that the actors weren't encumbered at all by anything like a big heavy facial rig, and instead they could just do their acting as if they were in the real world and without any limitation. And the second thing they had to get right was that because the second half of this film is basically set in the fully digital world of Pandora, they also needed a way to film authentically in a digital landscape whilst also filming and capturing the many different actors' performances. And so this meant that they were also going to have to create a special camera system that would allow them to film within this digital world, again, just like it really was the real world. Because, considering how CGI heavy this movie is, if Cameron couldn't direct all of this on set, then he was going to have to wait until everything had been made on the computer and would then have to manage thousands of artists and would need to individually get into each of their heads to explain exactly how he wanted the camera or the digital character to move or emote in every single scene of this movie in order to make it match the singular vision that he had in his head and not make it feel like a haphazard mismatch of thousands of different animators, different styles, all being blended together, as that, of course, would just be an absolute recipe for disaster. Not because the artists themselves weren't talented, but just because, in addition to all of the reasons we just listed, you also just lose so much reality this way, as by doing everything so synthetically, you no longer get the little things like those little imperfect shakes as the camera moves, or those happy accidents where an actor just tries something a little different and somehow it just massively elevates the scene. And at the end of the day, these little details do a lot of work to make a heavily digital film not feel like it's just CGI. And so, to answer all of these issues, this was why the team decided to massively refine this cutting-edge, diamond-in-the-rough, motion-captured camera system that had recently begun development on films like The Aviator. As this motion-captured camera system would allow James Cameron to look at a screen on his camera and actually see a real-time, low-resolution representation of what the CGI world would look like as he moved the camera around. And so yeah, this was basically just like a computer game where you can run around the fake world and turn the camera to see different parts of it. Except with this system, it's almost like James Cameron himself was the player and the camera he's holding was the camera. Meaning that not only could he walk around and frame things in this digital world exactly like he would in the real world, but also he could come in and customize this fake digital set to look exactly how he wanted. So for example, if he wanted a certain type of tree in the background of what he saw on the camera, he could have it because this is all in a fake world where you can just customize it really quickly and easily. And so with this system, the filmmaking freedom that he acquired was, to be honest, just completely ridiculous and just like nothing else I've ever heard of. And to be honest, I literally don't think I can do it justice by just explaining it verbally. And so instead, throughout this video, I'm just going to give constant examples of just how liberating this was. But yeah, with this finally locked down, they now began to develop this facial capture technology with the goal of, like we said, designing a facial capture system that didn't impede on the actor's performance one bit. And so, in regards to this system, there were a few schools of thought as to how to do this at the time. And one of these schools of thought, which I'm going to call marker-based 3D facial capture, was incredibly accurate and could almost exactly capture the actor's performance beat for beat. However, to be this accurate, it meant that this method had to capture so much detail that they actually had to film the facial performance separately to the physical performance, which would of course very much ruin the goal that James Cameron and the boys had, where they wanted to film everything in the digital world naturally and just as if they were filming in the real world. And so that was why, in the end, Cameron actually pushed to use the second school of thought towards facial capture, which was a method known as image-based capture, and which was actually completely inferior to the marker-based method. But because of this inferiority, it did have one major upside, as all this second school of thought really consisted of was a small camera that was attached to a head-mounted rig and a few tracking markers that were painted on the actor's face. And so this meant that all it could really capture were the more broad strokes of the actor's performance, and not the really little intricate details that the marker-based method could capture. But Cameron pushed for this technique as a little camera like this wasn't going to get in anybody's way, and therefore everything could be captured at the same time. And so, to compensate for the inferior lack of detail that this method generated, the solution they came to was to just shift this problem to the back end of production and essentially just have the animation team fix it in post by basically making their CGI characters' faces so densely controllable and customizable that even when working with this limited amount of data, the animators would still be able to output a fantastic result from this motion captured foundation. And so, because they were shifting this problem to the animation stage, the filmmakers decided that to lend the animators a hand, they'd also record each and every scene with up to 10 different reference cameras, which could be used to capture every different angle of every different event, and therefore ensure that the animators would have all of the reference they'd ever need to mimic every little bit of the actors' performances perfectly on the CGI Na'vi, which overall sounds like a fantastic compromise, because James Cameron could film on set without limitation, and then the animators, who have a lot more time and freedom because they live in the CGI world, could use this extra freedom to fix all of the problems that were generated on set. But of course, as with everything that you decide to just fix in post, this one choice of technique turned out to be an absolute nightmare for the visual effects team, to the point where they said basically everything that involved facial animation was one of the hardest things in this film for them to pull off. But we'll get to the actual final quality CGI and animation in just a minute, because in the grand scale of Avatar's production, those steps actually did come quite a bit later on. And so yeah, once all of the concept work on the Na'vi, the animals, and the human tech was all finalized, which was a process that was happening alongside the rest of the research and development, this meant that the filmmakers finally had a complete proof of concept which they could bring to Fox Studios with the hopes that they could get this movie finally greenlit, which eventually it was, meaning that finally things could really kick off and they were actually able to start shooting this film for real. And so, to actually make this film, they basically had to separate it into two completely different film shoots, with the first shoot being in the USA on this motion capture stage, which they had begun to call the volume. And this would be where they'd capture everything involving the fully CGI creatures, characters, and forests of Pandora. And then the second shoot would begin much later on in New Zealand, and this would be where they'd film all of the real life stuff, you know, like the army soldiers and the soulless businessmen and the military bases and just all of that stuff. And so, because these two film shoots were so significantly different from one another, we'll cover the New Zealand shoot in just a minute and instead just focus on the brilliance of the shoot in the volume for now. Because I'll admit it, up until this point of learning about Avatar's production, I genuinely wasn't actually that blown away by anything that I'd learned about Avatar's actual CGI. As whilst yeah, it is all groundbreaking, nothing that I'd read about so far really felt like it had any soul to it, and instead it just kind of felt like constant problem solving. And in fact, I was actually about to stop making this video because, you know, I thought, who wants to hear about a bunch of tools getting refined over time to solve some really specific problems? But after learning about the lengths they went to in this particular shoot, I have completely changed my tune, and I'm so grateful that I persevered with this video, because this is where the efforts from literally everybody involved in this this film really begin to become apparent. Because, for example, even though their performances in the final movie were going to be fully CGI in the end, the actors behind these Na'vi still really did do everything you see in the final film so that the filmmakers could capture it all as realistically as possible on the computer. So, you know, they really trekked through the jungle to understand how it feels, they really learned how to ride a horse or how to shoot a bow and arrow, they really developed ways for the Na'vi to move that felt both majestic and otherworldly, or they really climbed up this big rope thing, and the actors did all of this so that the Na'vi really felt like these beings that were truly native to this world that did not exist. And then alongside these efforts from the actors, there was also this massive team of like tech guys and on-set people who enabled the entire technical side of this to be possible as well. Because I don't want to make it sound like after all of those years of research and development that all of this volume stuff just worked, because in reality, of course, there was actually constant iteration and refinement to the systems and the techniques they used, and this too reveals how the soul of this film can also be found within its technical achievements. As for example, usually films will have either storyboards or animatics where you can generally plan out what is going to happen very early on before you even get to the film set so that everybody can be on the exact same page and therefore know exactly which resources you are going to have to apply to what shot. However, whilst this is of course great for planning and is a really cheap way of knowing exactly what you're going to be doing, it does also come with a lot of issues, because how you imagine the shoot is going to go when you're sat in a nice air-conditioned office somewhere versus what actually happens when you get to the set and have to deal with the unpredictability of real life can be two very different things. And so this means that loads of little issues can pop up that you could probably never have even anticipated, which is why it was rather brilliant that James Cameron decided to use this volume and all of its fantastic technology for the planning stage of Avatar, because in theory all he'd need is just a few tech guys to run the volume and a few stand-in actors to play each character, and then he'd be able to very easily and very cheaply mimic the final shoot in a way that would be so accurate to the final shoot that they would be able to intercept all of these little unpredictable issues that could pop up, because now both the planning and the final shoot were going to be recorded under the exact same conditions, meaning that James Cameron would now have the luxury of being able to perfectly plan out this entire film without needing to pay for the expensive actors to be there. However, whilst this was a genuinely brilliant and revolutionary idea that would have saved them so many headaches, it turns out that they had so many little technical issues with the volume that they had to spend the vast majority of the 6 months which they had assigned to this planning stage just resolving these technical issues instead. Meaning that by the time they got around to doing the final shoot with all of the real, more expensive actors and stuff, basically nothing was ready, and therefore they had to do a lot of this film really quick and dirty by just rapidly chucking the scenes together with random different background objects and stuff to quickly build up the real-time video game style scene which you can see behind the actors here, which of course had a lot of consequences when it came to replacing the video game backgrounds with the proper CGI backgrounds, as we'll see in just a moment. But yeah, the point I'm trying to make is that getting this movie to work was just a constant uphill battle from the tech guys, and it seems like just every little thing they did came with its own unique problems that took them forever to fix. Like, for example, that the volumes tracking system would crash whenever they did a crowd scene because all of the testing they'd done so far were with just 2 people, and they'd not even considered what was going to happen when they introduced a crowd's worth of people. But despite all of these problems, it was of course also really worth it that they didn't just give up on shooting in this volume because of the fantastic advantages that this system enabled the filmmakers to have and how it allowed them to do things that would have otherwise have been genuinely impossible in this film. As for example, with this whole world being fake, it meant that when it came to doing things like these beautiful, massive, sweeping shots of Pandora, rather than having to get in a helicopter and fly through all of these mountains, like you'd have to do if you wanted to shoot this in real life, instead they could really easily replicate this by just shrinking the fake digital set down and then simply just walking throughout the tiny set like giants until they got the exact sweeping shots they needed. And then another example of this freedom is for things like the flight paths of the helicopters or the Banshees, as rather than having to wait for months for an animation team to come in and individually animate the flight paths for each of these elements like you'd have to do in a normal film, instead they just had people move little helicopter motion captured props around on set, literally just like a child playing with toys, and then generated their flight paths based off that movement in real time. And so this little trick of capturing so much on set like this, rather than having to wait months for it all to be done by the visual effects team much later on, had this fantastic impact on the realism of this film CGI. Because when you're going to have something be CGI in a film, there may be a basic stand-in object like a tennis ball on a pole, but overall, basically everybody from the camera operators to the actors have to just kind of imagine what's there in front of them, which of course can make things like the actors' jobs a lot harder to do, or lead to things like framing issues because the cameraman doesn't actually know exactly how big this animal is or exactly how it's going to move. As like I say, maybe it's been explained to them, but at the end of the day, they are just imagining it. And so yeah, stuff like this was obviously a massive help when it came to making sure this film felt natural, and also subsequently for keeping the interaction with all of these different creatures and parts of the world feeling so natural as well. And so yeah, considering both how good and also revolutionary the end result of all of this different interplaying technology was, I did want to just briefly explain what the key differences were between what James Cameron was seeing through his camera and what we saw in the final movie. Because even though the video game world is technically computer generated imagery, it of course looks nothing like what we saw in the final movie. And that's because, like we said, this video game style world was basically just a very low resolution placeholder so that Cameron could move the camera wherever he wanted, and it would be low enough resolution that the computer could calculate that in real time and give a response to that movement in real time. And so basically this was just a placeholder, and so therefore the final result which we saw in the final movie was going to be something that was completely reworked based on this placeholder meticulously by the visual effects artists at Weta. And so we can truly begin to understand just how tremendously difficult this entire process of reworking the placeholder was when we look at the genius way they made an entire planet's worth of fully digital rainforest and the very special steps they took to keep this much work from being an absolute nightmare for the visual effects team. Because yeah, when you're building a CGI forest, you can just randomly scatter some plants and trees and foliage around, and it could look okay, but of course in real life the distribution of plants is not just random, and in fact there's actually very specific reasons as to why certain plants would grow in certain places. And so to truly make Pandora feel like a living, breathing ecosystem and not just a random mismatch of plants, then the visual effects team basically had to mimic this lifelike distribution as well. And so that's why they not only had a botanist come in and actually figure out which types of flora a planet like Pandora would have and why they would have them, but this is also why they built this really complicated computer algorithm that could literally grow this forest on the computer in a lifelike way. And so I don't think there's any behind the scenes of this, so I'm just going off this quote here, but basically it seems like they could plant these little seeds which would then grow into trees, and then much like in nature, if some of those trees weren't getting enough light, they'd start to die off. And so by running a bunch of processes like this that all obey the laws of reality to determine where your different trees and foliage should grow, over time you can basically automatically generate a lifelike forest for each shot without having to manually go in and like logically figure out how this foliage should be distributed each and every time. And so yeah, this was a really brilliant way of going about doing this, and it probably saved them literally hundreds of hours, and it also just really nicely encapsulates how thoughtfully this film was crafted, that they genuinely tried to figure out how Pandora should work. But you know what? This thoughtfulness wasn't just limited to how they crafted the rainforest, but it also actually pretty much extended to all elements of this film's visual design. As for example, despite being 100% CGI in the final movie, all of the Na'vi's props were actually built first in real life by using the exact same methods and materials that the Na'vi would have to hand to prove that they were both possible to make in the real world and to test how or even if they worked. Or another example of this thoughtfulness was that they really figured out how each of these animals' autonomies would work and how the animals should sound and how they should realistically move with 6 legs. And so, to be honest, I probably could make this video hundreds of hours long and go into every little detail about how they made this world feel as realistic as possible and also just as possible as possible. But I think my editor Kia, who I highly recommend checking out if you want your video to be as well edited as this one, you can find a link to his page down below, would quite literally kill me if I made it that long. And so yeah, to save his time and yours, I will jump ahead a little bit, because basically once James Cameron had everything recorded in the volume, he was then ready to move on to the New Zealand shoot where he'd do all of the army base side of the film. And at the same time, because this volume shoot had now concluded, the visual effects team at Weta could finally also start adding in the final quality CGI, which sounds like the perfect idea. However, these two processes kicking off in parallel did pretty much immediately cause a massive problem for literally everybody involved, but at the same time also eventually had this genuinely genius solution that once again shows just how game-changing Avatar was. Because James Cameron was supposed to head down to New Zealand straight away so that he could immediately start preparing for the real life half of this shoot. But before he could leave the USA, he still actually had to finalize the edit for the digital half of the film which he just shot in the volume. Because he only wanted to give Weta the exact shots they needed at exactly the right timings that they needed to be, so that Weta didn't waste any time and money working on scenes or even seconds of a shot that weren't going to be included in the final cut of the film, which meant that Cameron was basically forced to stay in the USA for much longer than he wanted until all of these tiny little editing timings were figured out, which was a nightmare because this was going to put him in the exact same position he was in with the shoot in the volume as well, where all the time which he had assigned to this New Zealand shoot was going to go to waste because he was stuck in America editing, and the moment he touched down in New Zealand, he was going to have to start shooting the real final film straight away, which was of course obviously not ideal, and it really was starting to look quite bleak for the film, until, rather brilliantly, the team realised that they could just plan the entire New Zealand shoot from the USA by using the unique power of the volume. Because the volume was an entirely digital environment that could be customised to do whatever they wanted, meaning that they could just load in a video game style copy of the New Zealand location, and James Cameron could simply walk through that environment and plan out everything for his real life shoot, like where the camera should go, how the set should look, how the lighting should be set up, etc. Which all meant that by the time Cameron and the team finally got to New Zealand, everything there was ready to go based off his exact specification, and they could just hit the ground running, and therefore the real life half of this shoot could properly commence. And so yeah, with this, just like with the digital side of the film, everyone involved in the real life shoot was once again incredibly thoughtful and therefore deliberately figured out the logistics of every little bit of technology you see on screen. So for example, they figured out how these helicopters would actually work, or how the arms of the robot suits should really rotate, and even went as far as genuinely building practical parts of lots of these machines so that the actors could realistically sit within them. But of all of this thoughtfulness, perhaps the most interesting and powerful tool they used was actually this other piece of completely groundbreaking technology that they developed, which they called the Simulcam, which once again had another massive impact on the realism of this film. Because in this footage, we can see that they used a lot of green screens, which of course are very useful for adding CGI around your actors, but also which of course have a lot of downsides. as for example, it's actually very difficult to frame an interesting looking cinematic background when all you have to work with is some big green wall. And so that was why it was genuinely brilliant that they managed to apply their real-time video game technology to these green screens as well, because this meant that when James Cameron looked through his camera in the real world, he'd be able to see a video game representation of what was going to happen on that green screen, allowing him to frame the shots to be as cinematic and aesthetic as possible in a way that no other film could. And it turns out that this Simulcam was so powerful that, despite this film's many technical breakthroughs, James Cameron actually believed that this would be the one tool that caught on the most from this movie and would therefore make the most difference in the world of filmmaking. Because not every film requires Avatar's massive breakthroughs, like complicated facial captures or needing to be filmed in this fully digital volume, but many films do use green screens, and so this meant this Simulcam could theoretically save a lot of different filmmakers a lot of different headaches. And so now this is just a little cut in from the future which I'm adding while I edit this, because in the original version of this video I was then going to go on to make a request asking visual effects artists in the comments if the Simulcam did catch on in any of their projects following Avatar as per Cameron's prediction. But in literally the last few days before uploading this video, I was lucky enough to speak with a few of the people who worked on Avatar, and the understanding which I walked away from those conversations with was that basically this Simulcam was so complicated to do and required so many different overlapping skill sets and talent and technology that it's pretty much a technique which can only be implemented correctly when the scales of your film are on the insane levels which the Avatar franchise demands, and therefore it seems like it didn't really catch on all that much because there was basically nobody else in the world making the type of film that it'd be worth pouring all of this effort into. And so, until I get the approval to post these conversations with the Avatar people and such, this is a bit of a source, trust me bro kind of thing, but in short, the complexities of this technique are basically just so in depth that it's pretty much a topic for its own dedicated video. So please subscribe if you want to see that, and I'll either post a video on this channel breaking it all down, or just post the raw interviews with the artists on my second channel, which you can find a link to in the description, or probably on my channel page somewhere as well. But yeah, with all of this in mind, we've finally covered all of the planning, filming, and environmental stages of this film, which means we can finally get onto how they made the actual CGI alien humanoids of this film, aka how they made the Na'vi. And so now I've covered the making of CGI characters on this channel a lot at this point, and so I'm not going to go into all of the little details such as how they made them emote like humans, or how they designed the light to realistically penetrate their skin, or anything like that. And instead, to save time, I'm just going to cover the things that were very specific to the making of the characters of Avatar, like for example, the fact that they were blue, and how that was an absolute nightmare for the visual effects team to get right, as apparently them being blue was something that was non-negotiable with this film, because James Cameron wanted them to look alien, but the colour green, which is so often synonymous with aliens, was already taken by characters like the Hulk, so blue it was. And with this blueness, they also had to be, and I quote, attractive and beautiful, because a large part of Avatar is a love story basically between two aliens, and so if these two aliens looked repulsive to the human mind, then it just wouldn't really work on screen. And so, to make them beautiful, not only did the visual effects team have to go to very great lengths to blend all of the subtle variations of colour that you see in human skin into their blue skin so that we could better read them as human, and they therefore appear more visually engaging to our human minds, but this also meant that they ran into very frequent issues with little unpredictable things, such as how should the orange light of a fire affect the blue tone of their skin? Because apparently when the light of a fire hit the blue surface, it actually resulted in this horrible grey colour, which suddenly turned these majestic, beautiful warriors into horrible zombie looking people. And so to to solve issues like this, the visual effects team had to constantly write very specific rendering tools to handle all of these little problems, such as one which would make the light of the fire affect the digital forest in one way, you know, a way which matched reality, but which would then affect the digital Na'vi in a completely different way, which could keep their skin looking blue whilst also still feeling realistic. And so it's this theme of making new, very specific tools to solve very tiny problems that is actually a major theme of as to why Avatar's CGI looks so good. As to make a film as ambitious as this work, basically every single tool which the visual effects team had at their disposal needed to be reworked in some way or another. Because, as we mentioned earlier, CGI evolves based off of the techniques that the film just before it used. And so this meant that the CGI tools that Weta had available to them when starting production on Avatar were basically the product of the last 10, 15, 20 years of research and development at Weta. And so this meant that they were very, very good, but this also meant that they had a long legacy of different parts being bolted on top of each other and sort of half fixes and temporary measures that then became permanent measures also being bolted on somewhere down the line, all of which are independently carrying their own issues that you really don't want to have to deal with when working on a film as big as Avatar. And so given this massive rework of all of their tools, I'm guessing that's why it took them something like 6 months to do the first 12 shots of this film, but by the end of production they were managing to churn out multiple shots per week, as I guess they just had so much new stuff to figure out in order to get this to work. But now, speaking of how difficult things got for them, as we mentioned earlier, apparently the facial animation was one of the hardest bits of this film for the VFX team to get right. Not only because the filmmakers had to use that technique we mentioned where they captured less data on the set and therefore decided that they would just compensate for that on the back end of production, which is here, but also because just getting the emotion of a human actor to read correctly on a Na'vi's face was a nightmare. As even though each Na'vi was directly based on their human counterpart, there were still so many subtle little differences in things like bone structure or skin tone that there was no way to do a perfect one-to-one transfer of the actor's performance to this CGI character's face. And so therefore, for each of these performances we see, a poor animator basically had to come in and meticulously fix all of this up by hand. And apparently this was such a challenge to get right that James Cameron actually said that he believes it would have been easier to do just fully CGI humans rather than CGI blue people, because then at least the facial animation of the actors would have been significantly easier. And so now, with all of that, we've basically broken down every little detail of this film, which means we've finally reached the big question of this video, which is, was Avatar just one big tech demo about blue people? Well, if I was going to be absolutely objective, then I would have to say, on a technicality, that it, pretty much is. Because, like we said, James Cameron literally came up with this film as a medium to push visual effects technology forwards. But I feel looking at it this way is just being a bit pedantic, especially when you consider the sheer amount of human effort that went into this just pushing VFX technology forwards. And so, if we're going to be fair to this film, I think we can reveal why a lot of people have some kind of issue with this film, but just can't exactly pinpoint what that issue is when we look at things like the very unique but also somewhat synthetic way that this film was edited. Because Avatar was edited like no other film, as even though when they did all of these virtual scenes, James Cameron did have a camera and was filming the actors with it, these sessions were much less about getting the camera positions correct and were actually much more about capturing and refining the actors' performances. Because once they had these performances captured and therefore stored digitally, it meant that they could then load these performances up again at a later date, which would therefore enable Cameron to come in with no actors and no people on set and have all the time in the world that he'd ever need to modify the cameras exactly how he wanted for each and every shot. And as he did this process of repositioning the cameras, he would also have everything new that he was doing be edited into the film in real time so that he could instantly review it and make sure that he liked it. Meaning that between this camera repositioning and this real-time editing, he basically had complete freedom to continuously chop and change the flow of every little thing thing until these fully CGI sections were literally perfect, which sounds genuinely amazing and was also a very thoughtful and powerful use of all of this technology which they developed. But I also personally think this is something which had the potential to really work against the final quality of this film. Because when literally every scene is absolutely perfect like this, it just gives this entire movie this really unnatural synthetic feeling that just no other film has, because it's actually quite strange that there's just nothing wrong with anything you see, because the human brain really actually does not like perfection all that much. And of course, this feeling of a synthetic production really isn't helped by the fact that so much of this was made on the computer with CGI, as this is a medium that already struggles with feeling synthetic. And so when the story of this film is quite safe, and then you also mix in the almost infinite freedom of CGI, where you can do pretty much anything you want, which was then again mixed in with this new seemingly infinite freedom they found from things like these revolutionary editing techniques and such, I really can understand why some people think this film doesn't have that artistic, rough around the edges, warts and all feeling that other films often have. And so yeah, on this channel I typically do try to defend CGI from its common kind of bad criticisms. For example, that people think it's either just a lazy cop-out for the filmmakers, or that practical effects are always better, or that because one bit of CGI looks bad, therefore all uses of it are bad, even though it's being used all over the place and you just never notice the good stuff because that's the whole point of it. However, I do have to say that Avatar raises a really interesting argument when it comes to visual effects, that it's not just all about making sure the CGI looks good, but that actually at the end of the day, it's also about the story which that CGI tells, how it tells it, and therefore subsequently the emotions that all of this stirs in the audience. But at the same time, whilst all of that is kind of true, this also isn't the whole picture, and so in the interest of fairness, let's also mount a defense of Avatar as well. As yeah, whilst a lot of this film may have been synthetic, at this point I think we've also sufficiently highlighted that there was a tremendous amount of human effort behind everything we see on screen. And with this, I don't just mean the CGI or the props or how they really figured out how all the technology should work, but I also mean this with the effort they put in when it came to releasing this film across the thousands of different cinemas across the world. Because rather than doing what every other film did, which was to send one version of the movie to every cinema that may or may not look or sound good at your local cinema, for Avatar, they instead actually created multiple versions of this film that were deliberately tailored to the multiple types of cinema setup that you can find across the world. Meaning that no matter what cinema you watch this film in, you are going to have the best possible presentation of it, which is actually a fairly common practice nowadays. But back in 2009, Avatar was the first film to do this, presumably because the people who made this did care and did want audiences to enjoy the product of thousands of people's work, which to me is a level of thoughtfulness that I would not associate with either a tech demo or something that was soullessly made. And so now finally, I also wanted to mention that criticizing Avatar for just having lots and lots of CGI is actually just a very unfair criticism to begin with, because I feel like sitting here and trying to justify all of this CGI by saying that it's full of human craft and loads of work and effort went into it, and so therefore it's not just a tech demo, is almost like I'm just arguing from the paradigm that CGI is this inherently bad thing and therefore it needs a reason to exist. Because, for example, it's fine to say that you like the Mission Impossible films for the crazy stunts, as those stunts kind of are the star of the show in those movies. But if you say you like Avatar because of the star of that film, you know, it's amazing CGI, suddenly you're the weirdo that's got to justify it by making a 40-minute long YouTube video autistically analysing every little thing they did. So yeah, to conclude all of this, people complain that movies are getting too repetitive, but they also like to complain when a film attempts to do something very novel with modern technology. So overall, I feel there's good arguments both for and against this film, because maybe it is too perfect, but then maybe that is what it takes to push boundaries like this. Because if Avatar was rough around the edges, videos, I'm sure it'd also get criticised for not being perfect. Because if there's anything worse than perfect CGI, it's bad CGI. But yeah, thank you for watching, everyone. And if you like this video and you want to see even more, then you can actually find an extended cut of it with timestamps to each extended section for less than like $2 on our Patreon, as I had to reduce the length of this YouTube version because the last time I uploaded a long video, the YouTube algorithm brutally punished me for leaving my little box. And so please go check out the Patreon just to support the channel, and because there's loads of other exclusive content on there as well. So there's probably a link down below to check that out. And with that, I'd also like to thank all of my Patreon supporters. So that is a thank you to Darth Gator, Modern Adventurer, Cthulhu88, Chris Colleen, Rodrigo, Tomaz, Kia Edits, and then an even bigger thank you to Lime, Jalan Van Menzel, Rye Jones, and Nathan Kelstadt, and then just an absolutely massive thank you to Darren Birmingham.